Before dawn on March 20-3, 1940-3, in central Tunisia, the El Ghida Valley was still shrouded in gray. 50 tanks of the German 10th Panzer Division rumbled into the valley floor, their engines echoing off the hills. The tank commanders were not nervous, and they had every reason to be confident about what was about to unfold. Just 4 weeks earlier, these same Americans had been shattered at Kasserine Pass, scattering in disarray, losing entire regiments. German officers had filed reports that read like autopsies: poor coordination, no discipline under fire, missing commanders. One German staff officer described the American retreat as something far closer to a stampede than any organized withdrawal. So when the 10th Panzer came through the pass at El Ghida that morning, they expected the same army and the same confusion. They expected the same soft center that would crack the moment steel hit it. But this time, they were wrong. The first wave of German tanks hit a minefield no one had told them about, forcing them to slow their advance. When they slowed, American artillery opened up from positions that had been carefully registered days in advance. Tank destroyers struck from concealed angles. The 1st Infantry Division did not scatter, and it did not flinch. Major General Terry Allen, commanding near enough to see German tank dust, was told his headquarters might be overrun. His answer was 5 words: "I will like hell pull out." By midday, 30 of the 10th Panzer Division's 50 tanks were burning. The rest pulled back. The German officers who had written those autopsy reports just weeks earlier now had to write new ones. These new reports read very differently. This is what truly matters. It had been only 20-7 days. 20-7 days between the worst American defeat in the European theater and the first American victory over German armor. Not 20-7 months, not a year of retraining in England. 20-7 days in the same desert with largely the same soldiers. And this was only the beginning. What happened between Kasserine and El Ghida was not a fluke or mere luck. It was not simply one general replacing another. It was something the German army recognized, named, and watched with increasing alarm. Across 2 years of war on 3 continents, German officers kept returning to the same conclusion in their reports and interrogations. They phrased it differently, but the core was always the same: the Americans never made the same mistake twice, not once. Not in North Africa, not in Sicily, not in the hedgerows of Normandy, not in the Ardennes. Every time the Germans found a weakness and exploited it, that weakness vanished. Every trap they set worked once, and never again. Every tactic that broke an American unit in January was useless by March. This was not how armies behaved. The Germans knew this. They had fought the French, the British, the Soviets. They understood institutional inertia. They understood how long it took for a lesson learned in blood to travel from the front line to a training manual to a replacement soldier. But the Americans did it in weeks, sometimes in days. The question this video will answer is not whether the Americans learned fast. The Germans themselves confirmed that. The question is how. What was inside this army? What mechanism? What structure? What invisible thing made it capable of doing something no other army in the war could match? The answer is not what you would expect. It did not start at the top. It did not come from a general. And the Germans, who understood it better than almost anyone, could never copy it. For a reason that says more about their own army than it does about the American one. But to understand that answer, you first have to understand how badly things had broken. Just a few weeks before El Ghida, and what one man found when he walked into a cone and post carved into a cliff face. On February 14th, 1940-3, 5 weeks before those German tanks burned at El Ghida, General Dwight Eisenhower visited the front lines near Sidi Bouzid. He inspected the positions. He spoke with officers. 3 hours after he left, 140 German tanks came through F8 Pass like a battering ram. What happened next became the worst American defeat in the European theater. But the defeat itself is not the point. Defeats happen. Armies lose battles. Good armies, experienced armies, armies that go on to win wars. What matters is what broke. Because what broke at Kasserine was not courage. American soldiers fought. Many of them fought hard, in small groups, surrounded, without orders, without support. What broke was the system above them, and it had been breaking for weeks before the first German shell landed. The man responsible was Major General Fredendall, commanding the U.S. II Corps. Fredendall had set up his headquarters in a ravine 70 miles behind the front. Some accounts say closer to 100 miles. He had ordered an entire battalion of engineers to blast tunnels into the rock face, constructing an elaborate bomb-proof complex. While his combat units dug shallow foxholes in the desert, troops called the place Shangri-La, a million miles from nowhere. Others called it Lloyd's very last resort, hold that detail a battalion of engineers building a general's bunker while combat units lacked basic fortifications. It will matter later when you see what a different kind of army did with its engineers. Fredendall never visited the front. He issued orders over the radio using a private code of slang he had invented himself. Infantry units were walking boys. Artillery was popcorn guns. Map coordinates were replaced with phrases like the place that begins with C. His subordinates spent precious hours trying to decode what their own commanding general was telling them to do. On the day of the German attack, one of his orders read, "Move your command, i.e. the walking boys, pop guns, Baker's outfit, and the outfit which is the reverse of Baker's outfit, and the big fellows to M, which is due north of where you are now, as soon as possible." That was a real order issued during combat to men who were about to die. The result was predictable. Units worse, scattered across a 30-mile front with no mutual support. The 1st Armored Division had been split into fragments against the protests of its commander. When 50-1 American tanks counter-attacked on February 15th, they advanced in parade ground formation straight into a line of concealed 80-8 guns. The Germans let them close the distance, then opened fire at ranges where American guns could not reach. Their tanks were destroyed in minutes. One soldier who watched it said to words it was murder. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, George Patton's own son in law, was captured that day on Jebel es-Souda. He would spend the next 2 years in a German prison camp. The 160-8th Infantry Regiment was effectively destroyed. By the time the battle ended on February 20-4th, American casualties exceeded 6,000. Equipment losses worst aggravating. But here is the number that matters more than any of those: the speed of what happened next. On March 5th, Eisenhower visited I Corps headquarters one last time. He pulled aside Brigadier General Omar Bradley and asked a simple question: "What do you think of the command here?" Bradley's answer was just as simple: "It is pretty bad. I have talked to all the division commanders. To a man, they have lost confidence in Fredendall." The next morning, March 6th, Major General George Patton walked into Fredendall's headquarters and took command. Think about that timeline. From catastrophic defeat to change of command in 10 days. Not 10 months. Not a board of inquiry that reported in the fall. 10 days. And what Patton did in the 17 days between taking command and the Battle of El Gita tells you something about how the American system actually worked. Because it was not just Patton. Patton was the visible part, the part the cameras caught, the part that makes good cinema. He enforced helmet discipline. He fined officers $20-5 for missing neckties. He told his staff he expected to see casualties among officers that would prove a serious effort had been made. But underneath Patton's theater, something quieter was happening. Something that did not make the movie. Reports were being written, not by generals, but by lieutenants, by sergeants, by privates. These were men who had survived Kasserine and could articulate exactly what had gone wrong at their level, what weapons had failed, what formations had gotten men killed, what orders had made no sense, what the Germans had done that worked. These reports did not sit in a filing cabinet. They moved fast. And what they set in motion was a process that the German army, an army that prided itself on being the most professional fighting force in Europe, had no equivalent for. Not because they lacked smart officers, not because they lacked combat experience, but because of something built into the architecture of their own military culture that made it structurally impossible. Remember that phrase, structurally impossible, because the answer to why Americans never made the same mistake twice is inseparable from the answer to why Germans kept making theirs. Here is something most people never think about. After a battle, someone has to sit down and write what happened, not the official story, not the version that protects reputations. The raw version. What worked? What did not? Who died and why? What the enemy did that no one expected. In most armies in 1940-3, that report traveled up the chain of command and was filed. If it contained something embarrassing, it was rewritten. If it contradicted a superior's judgment, it disappeared. The American army did something different. It published the raw reports, literally published them in pamphlets that were distributed to every unit in the theater. And it did this while the war was still being fought. Not after, when the stakes were over and the egos had cooled. The speed was the point. A lesson that arrives in 6 months is a lesson that arrives too late for the men fighting right now. The American system was designed to get lessons to the front while the front still existed, and the raw material of those lessons came from the men closest to the fighting. A tank commander at Kasserine wrote that his unit had been sent into battle with no infantry support, no air cover, and no communication with units on either flank. A rifleman reported that German machine gun positions were invisible from ground level, but could be spotted by the muzzle flash pattern at dusk. A forward observer described how American artillery fire direction was too slow, taking 20 minutes to respond to a request, while German response time was under 5 minutes. A platoon sergeant wrote that his men had been issued the wrong ammunition for their mortars, and that when they tried to request the correct type, they were told to fill out forms in triplicate. A tank gunner described firing at a German Mark IV from 800 yards and watching his shells bounce off the armor like gravel. These were not complaints, they were data. And what the American system did with that data had no parallel in the German army, the British army, or any other fighting force on the planet. The War Department in Washington published a series called Combat Lessons. Its subtitle was Rank and File in Combat, What They Are Doing, How They Do It. General George C. Marshall himself wrote the introduction. The purpose, Marshall stated, was to give every officer and enlisted man the direct benefit of battle experience from every theater, without delay. That last phrase is the one to remember without delay. Here is what that looked like in practice. A rifleman in Tunisia discovers that German machine gun positions are invisible from ground level. He tells his platoon sergeant. The sergeant includes it in his report. The report reaches the division, then Washington. Within weeks, that observation appears in a printed pamphlet shipped to every training camp. A 19-year-old from Ohio who has never heard a shot fired reads it in a tent in Iran. 6 weeks later, he uses it. He lives because a man he never met saw something and someone listened. This is exactly how the system functioned. The European theater ran its own parallel version called Battle Experiences, even more specific, detailed tactical observations from units fighting in northwestern Europe. Compiled and distributed while the fighting was still happening. A lesson from a failed river crossing in October could reach a unit attempting a different river crossing in November. The cycle was measured in weeks. But the pamphlets were only one layer. The Army Ground Forces headquarters in Washington's and observer teams directly into combat theaters. These men watched operations, interviewed soldiers from privates to generals, and flew back with reports that went straight to the people redesigning training programs. When an observer team returned from Tunisia in early 1940-3, the infantry training curriculum at Fort Benning changed within 60 days. Not the next year's curriculum, the one being taught right now to men who would land in Sicily in the middle of the war. Think about the speed of that loop. A mistake made in February. A report written in March. A training change in April. A soldier who benefits from that change in July. 5 months from error to correction, across an ocean, through a bureaucracy, in the middle of a global war. Now hold that in your mind. That speed. That willingness to let information flow from the bottom to the top. From a private's observation to a general's training directive. Because you are about to see what the same process looked like in the German army. When the Allies interrogated captured German officers, they returned again and again to the same question. You kept saying the Americans learned too fast. You wrote it in your reports. You said it in your debriefings. So tell us, why could you not do the same thing? Their answers were remarkably honest and remarkably damning. A German officer captured in Normandy in the summer of 1940- foretold his interrogators something that had puzzled him since North Africa. He said the Americans he had fought in Tunisia were clumsy, predictable, and easy to outmaneuver. The Americans he fought in France, 18 months later, were a completely different army. Same uniforms, same equipment mostly, but they moved differently. They reacted differently. They did not do the things that had gotten them killed before. He said he had watched the same transformation happen to the Soviets on the Eastern Front. But it had taken the Soviets 2 years and cost them millions of men. The Americans had done it faster, and he could not understand how. Here is what he could not see. In the German army, information about what worked and what failed in combat traveled in one direction upward. A company commander might file a report. His battalion commander would read it, decide what was relevant, and pass a summary to the regiment. The regiment would filter it again before sending it to the division. At each level, details were lost, nuance was stripped, and anything that contradicted the judgment of a superior officer had a way of disappearing entirely. This was not a policy failure. It was a cultural one, and it ran so deep that most German officers did not recognize it as a flaw. They saw it as discipline. In the German military tradition, an officer's authority rested on the assumption that he knew more than the men beneath him. A lieutenant did not correct a captain. A sergeant did not suggest that a colonel's tactics were wrong. The relationship between officers and enlisted men had been described by the Germans themselves as one in which officers have always treated their men as cattle. That is not an American characterization. That is a direct quote from a German officer reflecting on his own army. Now put a man like that into a system and ask him to learn from a private's observation. Ask him to take a sergeant's battlefield report and use it to rewrite doctrine. Ask him to admit in writing that a 19-year-old conscript saw something that a general missed. He cannot do it. Not because he is stupid, not because he lacks courage, but because the entire structure of authority he lives inside makes it impossible. To accept information from below is to admit that below has something he lacks. And in the German system, that admission destroys the foundation on which command is built. So reports from the front did reach Berlin. German staff officers were meticulous record keepers. They documented everything. But the reports described what happened. They rarely asked why something had failed at the small unit level, and almost never included the voice of the men who had actually done the fighting. Compare that to the American combat lessons pamphlets, where a staff sergeant is quoted by name describing how he kept his squad alive, and his words are printed alongside a general's tactical assessment, as if both carried equal weight. In the American system, both did carry equal weight because the underlying assumption was different. The American assumption was not that officers knew more than enlisted men. The American assumption was that the man closest to the problem saw it most clearly, and the system's job was to get what he saw to the people who could act on it. This was not idealism. This was engineering. The American Army in 1940-3 was barely 2 years old as a mass force. Most of its officers had been civilians in 1940. They did not carry generations of military tradition. They carried habits from a civilian world, where a factory foreman's suggestion could redesign a production line, where a sales clerk's complaint could change a company's policy, where information flowed in whatever direction it needed to flow to solve the problem. They brought that instinct into the Army, and the Army, to its enormous credit, did not crush it. But there is a layer beneath even this, because the American advantage was not just that information traveled upward, it was what happened when it arrived. And to see that, you have to go back to the hedgerow country of Normandy in the summer of 1940-4, and watch a sergeant from New Jersey do something that no German enlisted man would have been permitted to do. By late June 1940-4, 3 weeks after the D-day landings, the American advance in Normandy had stalled, not because of German resistance alone, but because of the land itself. The Normandy countryside is divided into small, irregular fields bordered by hedgerows, not garden hedges. These were ancient walls of earth and rock, some of them centuries old, packed with tangled roots and dense brush, rising 6 to 15 feet high. Every field was a fortress. Every gap in a hedgerow was a kill zone. German machine gunners dug directly into the embankments. Mortars were pre-registered on the only openings. A single squad with the right position could stop a company. American tanks were useless. When a Sherman tried to climb over a hedgerow, its belly rose skyward, exposing the thinnest armor. Its guns pointed at the sky. For those few seconds, the 30-3-ton machine was as vulnerable as an overturned turtle. The Germans knew this. They waited for exactly that moment. Dozens of tanks were lost this way. Engineers tried blowing holes in the hedgerows with explosives, but the blasts gave away positions and there was never enough demolition material. Bulldozer tanks could push through, but they were slow, conspicuous, and the Germans made them priority targets. The advance across Normandy slowed to a crawl, sometimes a few hundred yards a day. The army that had crossed an ocean and stormed a beach was being stopped by dirt and roots. For more than 5 weeks, this problem baffled every level of command. Generals discussed it. Engineers studied it. Planning staffs debated solutions. No one cracked it, and then a sergeant did. Curtis Cullen was 20-9 years old from Cranford, New Jersey. He was serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. He was not an engineer. He was not a designer. He was a tanker who had been watching his friends die in the hedgerows and was tired of it. The idea did not even start with him. During a discussion among soldiers about how to break through the bocage, a man described only as a Tennessee hillbilly named Robert said something that made the others laugh. "Why don't we get some sawteeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" Everyone laughed. Cullen did not. He looked at the German beach obstacles still scattered across the Normandy shore, heavy steel beams welded into X-shaped frames designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. He took one, cut it apart, and welded for steel tusks to the front of a tank. Then he drove the tank at a hedgerow. It worked. The tusks bit into the earth wall. The tank's belly stayed level. Instead of riding up and over, it punched straight through, exploding out the other side under a shower of dirt and roots. The 30-3-3-ton Sherman became a battering ram that could breach any hedgerow in Normandy at 10 miles an hour. The device was absurdly simple: scrap, metal, and a welding torch. Now, here is the part that separates this army from every other army in the war. Watch what happened next, and how fast. Cullen showed the device to his officers. They showed it to theirs. Word reached Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding 5th Corps, who arranged a demonstration. Omar Bradley, the man commanding every American ground soldier in France, came personally. Bradley watched a light tank with welded tusks ran into a hedgerow and burst through. Then a Sherman did the same. Bradley stood in silence for a moment. Then he gave one order: build as many as possible, as fast as possible. That evening, Ordnance Lieutenant Colonel James May Doris flew to England and commandeered every welding unit he could find. Within 1 week, 7 days, 3 out of every 5 American tanks in 1st Army had been fitted with the Cullen device. They called them Rhinos. Bradley held them back. He did not let a single Rhino tank enter combat until Operation Cobra, the massive breakout offensive launched on July 20-5th. When the Germans saw Shermans crashing through hedgerows they had considered impenetrable walls, their entire defensive plan collapsed. The bocage was no longer a fortress, it was just dirt. Remember what made this possible? Not just Cullen's ingenuity. The German army had ingenious men too. What made it possible was that a private named Roberts said something ridiculous, and no one punished him for it. A sergeant took it seriously, and no one told him to stay in his lane. A colonel flew to England the same evening, and no one asked him to file a request first. General watched a demonstration organized by men for ranks below him, and his response was not send me a report. It was build them now. From an enlisted man's joke to the transformation of an entire army's armor capability in less than 2 weeks. In the German army, Roberts would never have spoken, and if he had, no one would have listened. But the Rhino was not the end of the story. It was one example, the most famous one, of something that happened over and over again, in every theater, in every campaign, at every level. And each time it happened, the Germans noticed. Each time, they wrote it down. And each time, they faced the same question they could never answer. Because by the autumn of 1940-4, German commanders were dealing with a problem far larger than hedgerows. They were dealing with an army that seemed to get better between battles. Not just between campaigns, but between individual engagements. And the system behind that speed had just produced something that would hit them on a scale they were not prepared for. The Combat Lessons Program, the Observer System, the flat communication structure, the willingness to listen to anyone with a good idea regardless of rank. These were not separate innovations. They were parts of a single integrated system, and that system was now running at full speed. From Kasserine to El Gita are in 20-7 days. From El Gita R to Sicily in 4 months. From Sicily to Normandy in less than a year. Each campaign showed not just improvement, but acceleration. The curve was not linear. It was exponential. The American army did not just improve, it accelerated. In Sicily, in July 1940-3, 4 months after Caille, I Corps executed an amphibious landing under fire. They fought through mountainous terrain against German paratroopers. The coordination problems that had crippled units at Caille, Kasserine were gone, not reduced, gone. Air-ground communication, which had been nearly non-existent in Tunisia, now operated on a system where a forward observer could bring fighter-bombers onto a target within minutes. Artillery, which had been positioned too far back at Kasserine, now operated under a fire direction system so fast that German gunners reported being hit by return fire before their own shells had landed. For months, the same army, a different machine. In Italy, the learning continued. At Salerno in September 1940-3, German counter-attacks nearly pushed the beachhead into the sea. The Americans held, barely, and within weeks the after-action reports were moving. What had failed at Salerno was dissected with surgical honesty. By the time the next amphibious operation launched at Anzio in January 1940-4, the errors of Salerno had been catalogued, studied, and corrected. Anzio had its own problems, serious ones, but they were new problems, not the same ones. This is the pattern the Germans could not break. Every time they found an American weakness and designed a tactic to exploit it, the weakness healed before they could use the tactic twice. It was like fighting an organism that developed antibodies in real time. And it was not only happening at the level of grand operations. It was happening inside individual divisions, inside battalions, inside platoons. A company commander in the 20-9th Infantry Division loses 3 men to a German sniper who fires from a position the Americans did not expect. That night, the platoon sergeant writes down where the sniper was. How he was concealed, what gave him away, and what the squad did wrong. That report does not gather dust. Within days, other companies in the division know about it. Within weeks, it is in a mimeographed bulletin that reaches replacement troops before they have fired their first shot in combat. The Germans had snipers too, excellent ones. But they did not have a system that turned every sniper kill into a lesson that immunized the next unit. The U.S. Army published 9 issues of combat lessons during the war, each one a compilation of observations from every theater, organized by topic, written in plain language, distributed to every unit that could receive mail. In addition, the European theater published its own battle experiences reports and tactical bulletins compiled from frontline units and circulated while the campaign was still in progress. On top of that, Army Ground Forces headquarters sent observer teams into combat zones who returned with reports that directly changed training programs within 60 days. 3 parallel systems, all running simultaneously, all feeding information from the men doing the fighting to the men training the next wave of fighters. The loop never stopped. The German army had nothing like this. They had excellent intelligence services. They had meticulous operational records. What they did not have was a culture that treated a corporal's observation as raw material for institutional change. And by 1940-4, the gap had become something German commanders could feel in every engagement. A German officer who fought the Americans in both Tunisia and France said something during interrogation. He said that fighting the Americans was like fighting water. You could dam it, divert it, even stop it temporarily, but it always found another way through. And every time you stopped it, it learned the shape of your dam. Hold that image because it explains what happened next better than any tactical analysis. In December 1940-4, the German army launched its last great offensive in the West, the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, complete surprise. Winter fog that grounded Allied aircraft, a front held by resting on inexperienced American divisions, everything favored the attacker. The Germans hit a seam in the American line and drove a bulge 50 miles deep, and for the first few days it worked. American units were overrun, cut off, destroyed. Entire battalions surrendered. The confusion was real. The panic in some sectors was real. But something else was also real, something the German planners had not accounted for. The speed at which the American army reoriented. Within 40-8 hours of the initial assault, Eisenhower had identified the threat, shifted reserves, and made decisions that would shape the entire battle. Patton, now commanding 3rd Army far to the south, was asked how quickly he could disengage from his current offensive, pivot 90 degrees, and attack north into the German flank. His staff had already prepared 3 contingency plans. Patton gave a number that made the room go silent 40-8 hours. The assembled generals did not believe him. A 90-degree turn by an entire army in winter over icy roads with full logistics. That was not something armies did in 2 days. It was something that took weeks of planning. Patton did it in less than the 40-8 hours he had promised. Elements of his 4th Armored Division reached the besieged garrison at Bastogne on December 20-6th. For days after he had received the order, he had moved 100,000 men in their equipment over 100 miles in winter. But the speed of Patton's turn was only the most dramatic example. American divisions that had never fought together were reassigned, combined, and thrown into defensive positions within hours. Communication networks were rebuilt on the fly. Supply lines were rerouted. The organism adapted. The German plan had assumed that surprise en masse would shatter American cohesion the way it had shattered the French in 1940 and the Soviets in 1940-1. It did not account for an army whose institutional reflex, at every level, from private to supreme commander, was not to freeze when the plan broke, but to build a new one. And this reflex did not come from nowhere. It came from 2 years of a system that had trained every officer, every sergeant, every soldier to treat failure not as a verdict but as information. There is one more layer to this, the deepest one. Because the question is not just why the Americans could learn. It is why the Germans could not. And the answer to that question does not lie in training manuals or organizational charts. It lies in something that happened to the German army as the war went on. Something that made their own learning not just slow, but actively dangerous. In the German army of 1930-9, a junior officer could still push back. A Wehrmacht inherited from the Prussian tradition something called Auftragstak mission minus I porters. A commander told you what to achieve, not how to achieve it. A lieutenant on the ground had latitude. A captain could adapt. In the early campaigns, Poland, France, the opening months of Russia, this flexibility was devastating. German units improvised, exploited gaps, made decisions faster than their opponents. It was one of the great military advantages of the first half of the war, but by 1940-3, that flexibility was dying. The reason was not tactical, it was political. As the war turned against Germany, Stalingrad, Tunisia, the grinding losses on the Eastern Front, Adolf Hitler tightened his grip on military decision-making. Commanders who retreated without permission were relieved. Officers who reported unfavorable realities were suspected of defeatism. After the assassination attempt of July 20th, 1940-4, the atmosphere became poisonous. Political officers were embedded in military units. Loyalty to the regime became more important than competence. Reporting failure honestly, the very thing that made the American system work, became an act that could end a career. Think about what that does to a learning system. The raw material of learning is failure. You cannot fix what you will not name. You cannot improve what you refuse to measure. In the German army of 1940-4, naming failure was dangerous. A battalion commander who reported that his men had been outmaneuvered risked the implication that he had been out-minus General Ed. A division commander who admitted that his defensive positions had been breached in an unexpected way risked the question, why were your positions wrong? And behind that question was another one, unspoken but always present, are you loyal enough? So the reports kept flowing. German staff work remained meticulous to the end, but the content shifted. Failures were attributed to material shortages, to allied air superiority, to overwhelming numbers. All of these were real factors, but they became a way of not saying the harder thing. We were outsmarted. We were out-minus adapted. The enemy did something we did not anticipate, and we need to change how we fight. The American Army had no such barrier. When an American battalion commander reported that his unit had been mauled because his flanks were exposed and his artillery was out of range, no one questioned his loyalty. No one suspected him of defeatism. His report was treated as exactly what it was: information that could save the next unit from the same fate. The culture did not merely tolerate honesty about failure, it demanded it. And this is where the two systems diverged so completely that by late 1940-4, they were no longer fighting the same kind of war. The American Army was running a closed loop. Failure produced information. Information produced change. Change was distributed. The next unit benefited. The loop turned again. Each revolution made the army better. Each mistake, once reported, became a kind of vaccine. Painful for the unit that suffered it, but protective for every unit that came after. The German army was running an open loop. Failure produced reports. Reports were filtered, softened, explained away. Change, when it came, was imposed from the top by officers who were increasingly detached from the reality on the ground and increasingly afraid to tell the truth to the men above them. The loop did not close. The same mistakes recurred, and the men who could see this most clearly, the junior officers and then COS who did the actual fighting, were the men with the least power to change it. A German officer, interrogated after the war, was asked about this directly. Your reports consistently noted that the Americans adapted faster than any enemy you faced. Why could you not build the same system? His answer was not about resources. It was not about training. It was about fear. He said that in the German army, a subordinate who told his commander that a tactic was failing risked being seen as questioning the commander's judgment. And questioning a commander's judgment, particularly after 1940-4, was indistinguishable from insubordination. So men who saw problems kept silent. Men who had solutions did not offer them. And the army that had invented modern maneuver warfare slowly lost the ability to maneuver, not because its tanks broke down, but because its information system broke down. Remember the Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts, who said something that made everyone laugh, and a sergeant from New Jersey who did not laugh, but instead built the thing that broke the book age wide open. In the German army, Roberts would not have spoken, not because he lacked the idea. Ideas are universal. Because he knew what happened to enlisted men who spoke out of turn. Cullen would not have welded anything to a tank without written authorization from someone with authority to modify equipment. And even if he had, the device would have gone through channels, tested, evaluated, reported on, debated. While men kept dying in the hedgerows, the American advantage was not smarter soldiers. It was a system that did not punish them for being smart. And by the time the war entered its final months, this advantage had compounded so many times that German officers stopped being surprised by American adaptations. They simply expected them. They expected that whatever worked today would not work tomorrow. They expected that the next American unit they faced would know what the last one had learned. They expected to be out-minus adapted. What they could not do was stop it, because stopping it would have required changing everything. Not their tactics, not their equipment, not their training manuals, their culture. The relationship between a German officer, the men he commanded, the flow of truth inside their own institution, the willingness to hear bad news from the bottom and act on it at the top. And that was the one thing the German army, an army that could build Tiger tanks and V- to rockets and jet fighters, could not build. A system that learned from its own privates. On the morning after El Geta R, March 20-4th, 1940-3, the valley floor was still dotted with the burned out hulls of German tanks, 30 of them black and silent in the North African sun. Somewhere among the American positions, the men of the 1st Infantry Division were doing what soldiers do after a battle, checking ammunition, treating wounded, writing letters, trying to sleep. They did not know they had just made history. They did not know that the army they belonged to had done something in 20-7 days that most armies fail to do in 20-7 months. But the Germans knew. The officers of the 10th Panzer Division who had survived that valley filed their reports. And for the first time in the Tunisian campaign, those reports did not describe the Americans as clumsy or soft. They described an enemy that had been hit, had absorbed the blow, and had come back fundamentally changed. An enemy that no longer behaved the way it had for weeks earlier. An enemy that had learned. Those reports traveled up the German chain of command. They were read, noted, and, in the way of the German system, filed alongside the operational data. But they did not change anything. The German army did not ask itself the question that those reports should have forced: if the Americans can transform this fast, what will they look like in a year? By the time the answer arrived, it was too late to matter. Terry Allen, the general who had refused to pull out at El Geta R, went on to command the 1st Infantry Division through Sicily before being relieved. Not for failure, but because his division had become too aggressive. He later took command of the 105th Infantry Division and led it across Europe. He never lost the habit of leading from the front. Curtis Cullen, the sergeant from New Jersey, received the Legion of Merit for his invention. For months after Cobra, in the frozen nightmare of the Hurtgen forest, he stepped on a mine. He lost a leg. He was 20-9 years old. He went home to New York, worked as a salesman. When people tried to call him a hero, he pointed to Roberts, the Tennessee man whose joke had started everything. Cullen died in 1960-3 at the age of 40-8. Most of his neighbors had no idea what he had done. Roberts, the man who had said the words that no one in the German army would have been allowed to say, was never fully identified. His first name is lost. His rank is lost. The only thing history kept is his idea. And the fact that an army existed where a man like him could say it out loud to men who outranked him and be heard, that is the answer. The Germans said the Americans never made the same mistake twice. They were right. But the reason was not courage, and it was not genius, and it was not industrial production. The reason was that the American army was built, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design, and often by the sheer cultural momentum of a country where a factory worker could tell a foreman he was wrong, to do something that no other army in that war could do. It listened to its own people. Not always, not perfectly, not without resistance, not without ego, not without the thousand small frictions that slow every institution on earth, but enough. Enough for a private's joke to become a weapon. Enough for a sergeant's report to rewrite a training manual. Enough for a defeated army to remake itself in 20-7 days and come back as something its enemies no longer recognized. The German army could build the best tank in the world. It could not build a system where a corporal's idea reached a general's desk. And in the end, that mattered more than any tank ever built. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield.